we tend to think about the U.S. economy as one unique entity. Last night, President Obama was describing all the improvement in the U.S. economy. He was studying the unemployment rate that's fallen so much, the job creation that has increased, things like that. One number for the whole nation. But the reality is that if you actually look more closely, there's not just one U.S. economy. There are about 320 U.S. economies, one for each metropolitan area in the U.S. And what's striking, at least to me, is how different these economies are and how much apart they are growing. There have always been prosperous communities and less prosperous communities, but the gap between the winners among U.S. cities and the losers is the largest it has ever been and keeps growing with every passing year. I think you can probably group them in three broad classes. In the first group, it's what in my book I call American brain hubs. These are obviously places like this one, or Seattle, or Austin, or DC, or Boston. And what they all have in common is that they have an extremely high share of highly educated, highly creative workers. About 50%, 1 in 2 workers in the cities has at least a college degree or more. The type of employers that tend to gather in the cities pay high wages and make goods and services that are unique and hard to outsource in the short run to a faraway country. At the other extreme, there is a former manufacturing capital of the U.S., the Buffaloes, the Detroits, the Flints. In these places, the level of education is infinitely lower. 1 in 10 workers in this group have a college degree or more. And wages are much lower, population is shrinking, labor productivity is falling, and the type of employers that are attracted to these places are not there because of human capital of the workforce, are there because it's a cheap place to make cheap goods with low value added. And so they're in the wrong, they're competing with low-wage countries, and they're losing at that competition. In the middle, there is the rest of U.S. communities that are kind of undecided on which direction to go. This is actually most of U.S. communities. They could evolve toward a productive, highly successful economy, or they could fall back and decline as a Rust Belt community. And what's striking is, one is, how large is the gap between the top and the bottom, and how fast it's growing? Just to give you a sense, I mentioned number of college graduates. So 1 in 2 here, 1 in 10 in the Third America. Just to put this in perspective, this is much larger than the gap that we see between the U.S. as a whole and poor developing economies like Bolivia or Peru. So it's almost as within the country, our country, there are some of the most successful, productive, innovative local economy in the world that generate good jobs, highly paying jobs, and keep getting better. And then there are economies that are, relatively speaking, are developing country economies that are falling behind at an accelerated rate. Another measure is wages, of course. I mean, the wages of college graduates in the first group are 3 times higher on average than the wage of college graduates in the other group. And this includes everybody, the teachers and everybody with a college degree. Now, if you then look at workers in the innovative industries, the gap is even larger. It also includes the wage of those who are not fortunate enough to have a college degree. If you look at the wage of an high school graduate in the first group, is much higher, 2 to 3 times higher than the average wage of an high school graduate in the last group. Sure, cost of living here is much higher, but wages, if you have a high school degree and more, and you work in the local service sector here, your wage is like 2.5 higher than the similar worker with similar skills in Flint or Detroit. Now, it's not just that there are these vast differences, it's that these differences keep growing. For example, the wages and the skills of the top group, the successful cities, keeps increasing at a faster pace than wages and skills in the bottom group. So you see in my book and in my work, I see a lot of graphs that look like this. You know, the top group growing fast and the bottom group stagnating or not as fast. You know, whether this is wages or human capital or other indicators of health of a society. You know, you can look at things like marital stability, crime, longevity. I mean, one striking fact is the longevity, you know, how different is the life expectancy in the top group relative to the bottom group. The county that has the second highest longevity in the U.S. is Marin County. And the average male there lives until, I think it's about 76. The county at the bottom is Baltimore County, where the average male lives 15 years less. 15 years. Again, this is much larger. This is actually 3 times larger than the difference that you see between the U.S. as a whole and Peru and Bolivia in life expectancy. And so we see we see an economy, we live in an economy that tends to favor some communities and really punish other communities. Now, the question is why, and what are the underlying forces that are creating an economy where the winners get stronger and the losers lose speed. Well, I think a large part of the story has to do with human capital and where highly skilled, highly creative workers decide to locate. If you look at statistical analysis of the economic success of U.S. cities over the past 30 years, the single most important predictor of any economic outcome, whether it's employment or wages or productivity or innovation, it's the stock of human capital in that city. So the amount, the number, and the quality of the workforce in the city is measured by, for example, schooling or fractional workers with a college degree or fractional workers with a master's degree. They're all pretty much aligned. That's the single most important predictor when you look at, in the last 30 years, of the economic success of a community. Now, it didn't used to be this way. If you look at the previous 30 years, so the 30 years between World War II and 1980, the single most important predictor of economic success of the U.S. community was not human capital, it was actually physical capital, meaning the amount of machinery and public infrastructure and factories that were in place. So workers in the 50s, workers in Detroit were among the most productive and best paid in the nation and in the world because there was a tremendous amount of physical capital in Detroit. There was a tremendous transportation infrastructure that moved input and output outside. There were some of the best machines there, and that made the labor there extremely productive. Now, today, it's not the physical capital that is actually human capital. And so the success of a community crucially depends on the amount of human capital, so worker skills and ingenuity that decide to locate there. Now there's a question of why human capital tends to cluster. Why is it increasingly concentrated in these places? Why, say, Boston, San Francisco, have basically half of the labor force is extremely well educated, while there are other communities where it's 1 in 10. And we don't even have to go that far. I mean, forget about Detroit or Flint. If you just go to the Central Valley, you go to places like Merced or Modesto or Visalia, that's, the share of college graduates is pretty much the same as Detroit. It's 1 in 10. And it's lagging, as in real increase in 30 years. So why is that? Why does human capital tend to concentrate in these places? These are, by the way, some of the most hard places to do business in. Like, these are places where employers face some of the highest labor costs in the world, some of the highest real estate costs in the world. Regulations are suffocating in these places. And yet, somehow, these economies, the Boston, San Francisco, the Austin, the DCs, they keep attracting innovative employers and creative workers. So there's a growing body of academic work that tries to understand exactly what is it that makes workers here worth their cost. Why would it make sense for a startup that is created in Israel, Ohio, to locate here? What is it attractive here? Because clearly the costs are obvious. I can quantify them, to the cent. I can tell you this is how much labor costs more, how much real estate is more, it costs more here. But why? What's the benefit from the point of view of an employer? The reality is that labor productivity and the degree of innovation in the workforce here is so much higher than in other locations that more than offset the higher cost of doing business in a place like this. And the same is true in Austin and Boston and in DC and so on. Okay, well, but then why? What is it that makes them so productive? Because it's not that, the evidence suggests that when you move a worker from a location with very low levels of education to a place like here, that worker tends to improve their productivity and their degree of innovation, and it becomes a much better deal for an employer. So there is something here that is particularly conducive of generating new product, new idea, new services. There's a growing body of academic work on this. It's really at the forefront of a lot of what urban economists and labor economists are studying. We can get into the details if you're very interested. I think there are three broad classes of explanation for what makes a place like this particularly special. There in this room, I was just talking a second ago, people who actually have created their own firm and their own startup, so they might have their own view. But certainly the first force that a lot of the evidence points to is what economists call knowledge spillovers. Is the fact that if you are in a creative economy, you cannot be very far from your peers. I mean, it's clear to an academic. I mean, obviously my productivity crucially depends on the human capital of my colleagues. That's why we fight so hard on who to hire, who to fire. We really, my ideas depend on who I talk to, who I exchange ideas with, who I hear an opinion from. But it's also true in tech, it's also true in the broadly defined innovation sector, it's also true in pretty much any part of the innovation economy, whether it's biotech or social media or new material. I mean, your creativity, the degree of innovation crucially depends on who is around you, not just on your own skill. And there's a growing body of work, including mine, that points to how important that is. The second channel through which the magic of these innovation hubs and brain hubs work is the thickness of the labor market. So a thick labor market is a labor market where you have many employers looking for employees and many employees looking for an employer. And in places like here, the labor market for very specialized skills, imagine like biotech engineers who specialize in a particular branch of DNA recombinant technique. In a place like here, there's so many employers looking for jobs and so many employees looking for an employer that essentially the match between the employer and the employee is much better, is much tighter. So in a place like here, that specific biotech engineer with those very specific skills will find the employer that really values those skills. An employer will find that employee that they really need. Okay? Imagine the same person in a place like Chicago, just to mention one, like where there's very little biotech. Well, if there are only 3 biotech employers in Chicago, your match between employer and employee will be much less tight. You'll have to do something that you might not be the best person in the world. And so the thickness of the market is crucially important. And it really, again, there's a growing body of work that points to the fact that the quality of this match, it's really crucial in the success of the firm and the success of the workers who decide to locate in this thick cluster of innovation. Now notice that both the human capital spillover story, the knowledge spillover story, and the thick market story really involve some type of positive feedback, right? So the thicker a market gets, the better the match is. the more people around you there are to exchange ideas, the more you get productive. This is really where this positive feedback that it's sustained in economies like this one come from. Is the fact that the more success generates even more success. The more of tech workers of a certain type move here, the more attractive this place becomes for employers, the more attractive it becomes for workers, and so on and so on and so on. It's a path dependency phenomenon that really strengthen those cities that are lucky enough to have one of this cluster. And it makes it very hard from the point of view of the Flints of the Detroit to really jumpstart your economy. Because in this type of dynamics, nobody wants to be the first to locate there. So, in the last 3 minutes, I also want to touch upon the question of what does this all mean if you live here, but you're not in the tech sector. Because obviously this is a very contentious question that a lot of people ask, and they rightly so they ask it. Not everybody can work for a biotech startup. Not everybody can work for Google or for Apple or for Twitter. In fact, the vast majority of us doesn't. In the Bay Area, about the tech sector absorb, depends how you measure it, but absorb between 18 to 25% at most of the labor force. The vast majority of workers works in local services. About 2/3 of the workers are employed in local services. And that's just the same across all US cities. Without local services, well, it's where most of us work. It includes both professional jobs and non-professional jobs. On the non-professional side, it's the people who, they wait at the restaurant when you go to a restaurant, the people who sell you stuff when you go to a store, the people who drive your cab or your Uber car, the people who walk your dog, and so on. On the professional side are the architects, the engineers, the real estate developers, the carpenters, whose job is to essentially sell a service to the local economy. Okay. Now, one reason why the brain hubs of the US are doing so well, the main reason is not that everybody works in tech, everybody works in innovation, and so everybody has 200K salaries a year, and they all work for Google. The real reason is that wealth that is created in the innovation sector supports a much larger and better paid local service sector. Just to give you an example, like every time Twitter hires an additional software engineers here, like the next block, that extra money that that person brings here and spends on local economy means more job for the waiters, for the taxi driver, for the plumbers, for the real estate developers, and the architects, and the lawyers, and doctors. All these people have one thing in common: they sell a service to the local economy. So the demand for their services really depends on how much money there is in that community. It's a big effect. My estimate, I estimate using data not just from San Francisco but across all US cities. I call this the multiplier effect, and I estimate that this is a large number. In the long run, each additional job in the tech sector, it ultimately generates between 4 to 5 additional jobs in the local service sector. Now, of course, these are not as well paid, but they're jobs, and they tend to pay better in innovation hubs than in the rest of the US. Just to give you a sense, not just going back to the Twitter example, how large this impact is. Twitter today has about 2,000 employees. By my estimate, the existence of Twitter in San Francisco accounts for about 10,000 additional jobs outside tech in the community in the long run. This is like the fact over a 10-year period. So it doesn't immediately correct. It takes, at least the way I measure it, is within 10 years. So this is actually fairly remarkable. What it means is that the main impact that a company like Twitter has on the San Francisco labor market is not for tech workers. It's actually for workers who are very far from tech. And I think it raises, I think, an important point, which is in American brain hubs, people with tech job and innovation sector jobs are certainly doing well. But the reality is that other people are also doing well, including those that are not, strictly speaking, in the tech sector. In part because the tech sector supports a local ecosystem of local service jobs that employs the average worker, just like many of us in this room. And so I think that's one reason why I feel the current debate in San Francisco is highly misguided and misplaced. This notion that there's an inherent opposition between the tech sector and the rest of the economy, I think it's just not consistent with the data. The reality is that it's a tide that it's so forth. So this is a kind of like my short version of it, and I'm happy to, yeah.
Well, that's very elucidating and concise explanation. My question goes to the tide that lifts all boats and the multiplier effect. So every Twitter employee hires 4 other employees, but who can now hardly find a place to live here. So what does your data suggest for the kind of average wage of that multiplier effect, if you will, for 4 other people? And what's their ability to be able to live and partake of the quality of lifestyle that you're assuming, it sounds like you're assuming that they are imbibing because of, their beneficence of one Twitter employee.
Yeah, let me first qualify one thing, because so the multiplier comes both from the fact that the Twitter employees consume local services and therefore, as you put it, hires, right?
The dog walker, the waiter.
Yes, but also from 2 other channels. One is that the tech sector itself hires a lot of these people, like from security guard to cadres and it's particularly large because the tech sector is very intensive in that type of jobs. Contrary to like traditional manufacturing, where the multiplier is 1.6, it's about a third. In part because manufacturing firms use much less of that type of services. The 2 reason is that there's a multiplier of the multiplier. So like when the Twitter guy hires
the accountant,
the accountant himself then goes to the restaurant. So what I'm giving you is the sum of all these effects in the long run. But yes, of course. Then the question is,
what's the pressure? What's the trickle down pressure that it's creating?
I mean, there's no question that cost of living is much higher here. But in what you see. This is not the first time when you see a bump up in cost of living in San Francisco or in the cities. And what you historically see is that wages, nominal wages, ultimately, at all levels of the economy, ultimately catch up. It takes time. It doesn't, wages don't adjust immediately. And I think part of the struggle of the city right now is that the shift in cost of living was fairly sudden, and wages are in the process of catching up. But when you look at the cross-section of cities, and when you look at the median run, it's clear that wages in San Francisco are the best paid in the nation, in part because wages are so much, the cost of living is so much higher. Nothing forces people to live here. I mean, there's a reason why there are still waiters here, or for that matter in Manhattan. Now, that doesn't mean that everything is, there's nothing to do, or that everything is sunny. Clearly, if as a city, San Francisco was engaged in better, more proactive housing policies in order to allow housing supply to at least absorb some of that sudden increase in demand, I think rents would not shoot up so quickly. And more of that higher wages for the waiter would go into his pocket as opposed to the landlord pocket. So in some sense, the city, by constraining housing supply and pushing rent above what they should be, in some sense is shifting some of that wealth that the tech boom is creating from workers into incumbent landowners, or homeowners who are lucky enough to already have property on land. The other side of the equation, in my view, is transit. Because the reality is that any large metro areas, whether it's London, New York, or San Francisco, that has high cost of living, it's not like everybody, even with ideal housing policy, it's not like everybody will be able to live, in the most expensive part of the city. That's a matter. But, what's distinguished San Francisco relative to the New York and London is how poorly managed and poorly run is public transit, and scarce is public transit. So in a metro area like New York, people can live fairly far away in cheaper location and still access the highly paying job in Manhattan. I mean, it's not perfect by any means. Like London would be a better example of well-functioning transit network. Tokyo would be an even better example. In all these cases, you have this extremely high-paying job concentrated in a location, and then you have people who might not afford to live there, but through transit can have access to that. And I think that's another way in which the city is failing the low-income service workers here. The city and the region, actually. This is not just, this is by no means a city, just a city issue. It is the region that essentially, actually, in San Francisco, so for the Bay Area as a whole, we're talking about 20% innovation sector jobs. So I'm including not just tech, we're only fine, but biotech would be one, anything. But there's a lot of industries that arguably are, Macy's has their web division here. Walmart has their internet division here. Car manufacturers are putting their R&D labs here. Banks, East Coast banks are putting their R&D labs here. So these would all be classified as banking, retail, cars, and not that. But if you actually look closely at what they do, I think a good estimate is about 20% for the B2C.
Other cities like Austin or Boston, do they have the same problem that we have with that in the last, say, 5, 10 years, where there's rapid growth as these tech companies grow, same housing issues, same transit issues? So is it the era related, or is it San Francisco specific?
I think it's more pronounced in San Francisco. I think they all have sort of similar trends. Cost of living is increasing in Austin, in Boston, in Seattle, in DC, but it's quantitatively is more here. In part because our land use and planning policies are more stringent. Now, I don't know enough about Boston, but certainly more stringent than Seattle and Austin, and Raleigh-Durham or other. So I think Seattle is a very good example, which I often cite, because Seattle increase in labor demand is very similar to here. Like the increasing jobs, increasing wages, the type of the drivers are very, very, very similar to here. But the rent have increased about 40% less. They still have increased. And I was there last month, and I was talking with people in the media. The first question they had was, our rents are skyrocketing. We're this is a disaster, displacement. And I would say, well, try San Francisco. You guys are 40% better off. In part because their planning process is less political and a little bit more rational. That's my interpretation. And certainly it has allowed for more info. It has allowed for more info.
Greater production of housing.
They have, relative to the size, yes, great production of housing in the right spots. They don't have a great transit system either. They're struggling with it. In fact, they were saying, I wish we had BART. They have a light rail, but they're all laughing about it because it's not really important. So the transit problem are comparable, but I think the increase in housing supply has been more accommodating. And as a consequence, rents have increased, but not to the level of here. Now, Austin is another model. It's kind of the opposite model. Austin is a Texas model. There's very little constraints to housing supply. The problem there is kind of the opposite, is that instead of having, you have all this congestion. And so it they do allow for housing growth, but it's sprawl, and it doesn't, so essentially, it doesn't, you keep rent in check, but at the same time, you're stuck in traffic for an hour and a half. So, and I'm not sure whether that's a better solution, actually. I would argue that that's not a better solution. Probably a solution like Seattle, with increased transit investment, it might be a better alternative. But, this is not my job, the planners.
Enrico, what are some of the geographic and scale factors that contribute to these innovation economy hotspots? So you talked about most of these mid or some, mid to larger size American cities. You didn't mention New York, Chicago, or the comparison between San Francisco and San Jose. San Jose is like the 10th largest city in the U.S.
True.
Why aren't these places which, some research points to larger population results in greater frequency of innovations? Why aren't these larger cities some of our greatest hubs of innovation?
Yeah, it's a great question. Well, San Jose is definitely part of this brain hubs, no question about it, in terms of human capital, innovation, obviously. The San Jose metro area. New York is an interesting case. New York traditionally had very little tech, had very little life science research, had very little other form of innovation outside the financial sector. There was a lot of innovation in financial. There still is a lot of innovation in the financial sector. Probably, for the better.
I'm worried about that.
I'm not talking about math. There are some financial problems that are useful. Not all of them, but. New York, though, is actually in the last 5-10 years has been increasing very fast their share of specific part of tech. Obviously, space is scarce, so they still don't have life science, just because labs are landing testing. They still don't have new material robotics, but they do have a lot of software, internet, just because they have so much publishing that is natural for New York to attract, and so much advertising that is natural for them to attract an increasing slice for the tech sector. Everybody knows about Google, purchase of a block in I think Chelsea, but it's not by any means just Google. There's a lot of startups, and so it's at the same time where the financial industry is shrinking, in part due to Dodd-Frank and all the financial regulation that is put in place after the crisis. The number of jobs in finance are actually shrinking fast. Jobs in tech are increasing fast, and so they've more than offset their losses. Now, size is not guarantee of being a brain house. You mentioned Chicago. LA is another example. Relative to their size, neither Chicago nor LA are major producers of innovation. In part because neither Chicago nor LA have a very highly skilled labor force. When you look at the numbers, Chicago or LA are very far from this 50% college graduate that you see here. So it's, there are parts of LA that have been extremely successful, that have grown very fast relative to baseline. They tend to be, obviously, the west part of the city. But overall, relative to the size of the region, this is not a major job driver of the city. By contrast, you see places like Denver, which is not as large as Chicago, LA, but much higher level of skills and higher measure. Or Minneapolis actually is even better. So I don't think size per se is what matters. I think it's really size of the industry that matters. The thickness of the market, the relevant thickness of the market, is not the overall size of the metro area as much as the size of the specific industry or the specific industrial cluster.
Yeah. I guess what I'm reaching for is, are there some other place-based factors that result in these places having that knowledge spillover and the thicker labor markets that have to do with place-based phenomena about the quality or characteristics of a particular urban environment?
Different people differ on this question. If you ask, Richard Florida, he'll tell you, oh, it's all about the type of amenities that, yes.
Surfing, kiting, sailing. I was snowboarding in Tahoe last week, and I'm going cross-country skiing in Yosemite this week.
Yes, or the grunge music
Where
is,
in the world.
the story about Seattle is the grunge music and the underground scene. I'm very skeptical of that line of thinking, in part because, but in the specific example of Seattle, I don't think it's consistent with the story of Seattle. And broadly speaking, I think it's kind of mixing the cause and the effect. I mean, when you look at Seattle, I mean, it points specifically to the certain cultural background in the city, the music being one, that in his view attracted a certain type of creative class, which in his view then generated the innovation class. My reading of it is actually not, I mean, my reading of it is that Seattle was, in the 70s, was in deep trouble. Seattle economy was horrible in the 70s. Boeing was laying off people by the thousand. The rest of the industry were fairly traditional and old style. There was lumber and service for lumber, things like that. But it was the port, but nothing that really struck me as high value added innovation sector. And then the one thing that really changed in Seattle was that a small startup decided to relocate there. It was Microsoft. It was 79. And when you look at the data for Seattle, that's really the break in the trend. So we look at wages or job, good jobs or capital. Seattle is not doing any. It's actually underperforming relative to. And then after Microsoft, you start seeing like a growth that becomes accelerating over time, just like in this positive feedback loop dynamic that I was describing, with more and more tech firms locating there and kind of reshaping the entire local economy. And then the city becoming cool and interesting, and all the amenities becoming interesting. So my reading is exactly the opposite of Florida, is that the amenities are actually an effect. That the quality of life in Seattle, the quality of the cultural institutions, the quality of crime, like pretty much any indicator you actually look at actually follow economic growth, didn't precede economic growth. So that's why I'm a little skeptical of those single recipe solution. Oh, just get a great downtown with a lot of restaurants and the creative will flow and you get your Silicon Valley. It sounds great when you go to a mayor because you have something to propose, but I don't think it's consistent with neither the story of Seattle nor the broader example of other innovation hubs.
So isn't it in most cases the presence of great research university at the genesis of where these things start?
Yeah, so research universities obviously play an important role, and obviously, being here, everybody points to Stanford and possibly into Berkeley as important reason for why there is a Silicon Valley. But I think actually the effect of university is much more complex and nuanced than the simple story, oh, you get a great research university and then you're going to get an innovation hub. For once, Stanford, when Silicon Valley started, when Shapley decided to locate from the East Coast to here and started semiconductors in the Valley, Stanford wasn't that great of an institution. Stanford engineering department was mediocre at best. Stanford became a giant in engineering and a factory of startups, almost like an effect. It was a cause and effect of the growth of the Valley. I mean, Stanford last year raised more than $1 billion in endowment, and I'm just amazed, but sitting there, just amazed by the amount of money that is flowing to the university at all levels. So Stanford is great in part because Silicon Valley grew so much.
Bill
Stanford did play.
Moggridge, David Kelly.
I'm sorry?
Bill Moggridge and David Kelly.
Yeah, but so I'm not saying that Stanford didn't play an important role, but I'm saying
they contributed to the university through the strength that they built.
sure. I guess my point is that I see university more of a necessary condition more than a sufficient condition for innovation hub. I think that it's hard to have an innovation hub without a great research university, but having a great research university doesn't get you an innovation hub. go to St. Louis. WashU is great, but there's a lot of innovation in St. Louis. Even New Haven, for that matter. If you actually look at, probably the best, second or best university in the world, Yale, but New Haven is basically no private sector jobs in innovation outside whatever the university is bankrolling.
Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh.
Yeah, but so the point is that I can come up with Santa Barbara as a terrific university, but not really a lot of. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that university play a crucial role. There's a growing body of evidence that points to the location of, for example, academic scientists in biology as key determinants of the location of biotech clusters today. So there's a reason why San Diego has its biotech cluster, but the point is that it's not enough. You need it, but it's not enough. And typically universities grow in sync with the region.
So in this conversation we touched on a few times on the huge topic of affordability and displacement. And what's interesting to me, when we look not in this room, but at the larger discussion in the city, in the media about this topic, is what's interesting to me is it's almost entirely devoid of facts. No rationality. And other than facts, other than a couple of things I've seen you write in the Chronicle once in a while, but mostly no facts, no rationality, just hysteria. And as an educator, do you have any sense, how do you get people whose job it is not to study this, but whose job it is to drive a taxi, to actually get some facts about this?
Yeah, I think this is it's a problem that is, in general, I mean, a lot of communities have that issue. You see it often at the national level, but I think it's particularly, I completely agree, it's particularly pernicious, and you see that in San Francisco, where a lot of the policy making seems to be based more on some preconceived notion of right and wrong, as opposed to, actual empirical evidence and cost and benefit. And I think a lot of the problems with that the city is facing, you can trace it to this attitude. I'm not a sociologist, so I'm not going to speculate on where it's coming from. But I think you're absolutely right. It is particularly problematic in a city like this.
In the most highly educated city in the country.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is a particular puzzle, right? So you see, there are two amazing puzzles here. One is, why the hell we don't have a better paper? It's tradition. And the other one is why the most educated, smart, innovative city in the country is so backward-looking and so ideological.
Politics. The president of San Francisco State has a drawing on his wall in his office, and there's a guy standing there with two signs: truth that way, victory that way.
But just to sort of piggyback on this question, so not asking you to be a sociologist, but acknowledging that there seems to be a cultural disposition in this city. And from an economic standpoint, what is the cost of that cultural disposition? Because it seems to me you're outlining, you have economic drivers like tech, but call it what you will, and then you have other parts of the economy like housing. And if you listen to the word on the street, tech is creating the housing crisis. Well, San Francisco politics, City Hall is creating the housing crisis, or the board of supervisors, or what have you. And they've been doing it for the last 20, 30 years. So, what is the cost of our cultural disposition in the city as an economist?
Well, I think the cost is high, and I think the cost is disproportionately on the shoulder of actually the lower income residents of the city. That's the sad part of the side of this. I probably wouldn't go as far as saying that tech has nothing to do with the increasing housing prices. Tech is also increasing the labor demand and therefore the demand for housing, so it does play a role. But certainly, city policies are not helping. In fact, they're making things, they're not mitigating, they're making things worse. And I think the cost is actually not on those who, probably like most people in this room, who own a house. The cost is mostly, the incidence is probably mostly on the renters, who tend to be disproportionately coming from, not always, but necessarily. And so I think that's what's particularly puzzling in a city that is both well-educated and creative, innovative, and supposedly progressive. Is this inability or this immediate, this reliance on mental schemes that are frankly, again, more driven by the ideology than anything else. Is it the long wave of the 60s? Is it going to change? As we were talking earlier, that it might be that with an inflow of new people, you might look at the same problem with fresh eyes. Right? So when people first come here, and they say, well, why is that? Why there's so many homeless in the street? Why is this not working? But it helps reshaping, asking that, even just asking that question helps bring in new insight into the debate. So maybe, we might be, over time, with the transition out of the generation that, it had very important victories, but it's rooted in the 60s and an inflow of new insight. Maybe we can outgrow it. It's hard.
One thing I think would be interesting from the economic analysis too. There've been over the last 40 or 50 years well-intended policies that have unintended consequences, and to be able to quantify what it does. And for example, take rent control. It's a good idea for some people. I used to own a building, 13-unit building. One person, and they were all rent control. They did there for a long time. The one person needed subsidy. Most of the people were very wealthy people who were being heavily subsidized by the city, by us. The value of that building